Welcome to Hampden-Hampshire and Franklin Conservation District's joint winter workshop series on native plants. This is the second year of the district's native plant program, which is funded by a grant from the Massachusetts Department of Energy and Environmental Affairs. The goal of the program is to inform the public that native plants are essential to ecological health, and to go beyond this, to also equip people to include native plants in their home landscapes. The program includes this winter workshop series, along with in-person and outdoor events in spring through fall. If you live in one of the 3 counties we serve, our program also provides a free 1-hour consultation with a native plant expert at your home and a free starter set of native plants from one of our local native plant nursery partners. You can learn more about the program and request a consultation through either district's website, and those links can be found beneath in the video description. This presentation is a re-recording of the live event due to some audio difficulties with that recording. Today's presentation is titled, How to Maintain a Native Plant Garden, Managing the Changes that Occur Over Time, and will be presented by Amy Meltzer. Amy is on the steering committee of the Mass Pollinator Network, is an active member of Grow Native Massachusetts, and is on the research team of Elders Climate Action. She has been researching and growing native plants for over 10 years. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you so much for recording this again and for running a really terrific program. It's got all kinds of wonderful resources for helping people learn and get plants into the ground. So I really
Well,
appreciate
especially thanks to you. So thanks for providing all these wonderful resources and this talk and many others. So yeah,
it.
thanks for rescheduling since we had a little snafu with the first one.
We did. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And looks like we're all set. Does that look good? Megan, you can see this?
Yes, it's coming through great.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to be talking about today is maintaining a native plant garden so that gardens change over time. Native plant gardens have particular ways of changing over time. And I want to point out ways that we can handle the change so that we have the garden that we want and that we're continuing to support wildlife, which is a really essential part of native plant gardening. So I want to start by comparing native plant gardening with conventional gardening. In a conventional garden, the purpose is really to provide pleasure and convenience to humans. And traditionally, there's really little thought for the interaction of the plants in your garden with other species. And conventional gardens are designed to be unchanging through not allowing other species to move in, through not allowing plants to spread. And this is done by choosing particular kinds of plants, usually non-native plants or hybridized plants, by mulching heavily, by mowing, close to the ground. So it's really a controlled environment that's not designed to support other species. And native plant gardening is, I think of as ecosystem gardening. In an ecosystem, there are multiple species that have evolved together and they have grown to depend on each other for survival and their well-being. And everything in that environment is useful for food, for shelter, for reproductive habitat for various species. So as an example, plant material will decompose in place and return nutrients to the soil, which will be taken up again by plants. And then plants will be supporting insects and birds and other species. And the garden will be providing habitat to many species. So a native plant garden is really designed and maintained to provide a web of support for many species. And again, these relationships interact and will change over time. So briefly, the topics that I'm going to cover will be the biodiversity crisis. So if you've heard any of my other talks, you will have heard some of this. I'm just keeping a brief introduction, but I think this is really important for understanding why ecological gardening is so important. I'm going to describe the networks of relationships that can be supported in a native plant garden and then how to manage the change that happens, which you can see as either problems or opportunities. And I'll be showing you choices of solutions to things that are problematic in the garden. And then at the end, I'm going to go through a lot of resource slides so that you can see what we're going to make available to you. So this talk will be available as a video, and then the resource slides Megan is going to post as a PDF so that you can go through and make use of those resources so you can keep learning and also put these principles into practice. So I want to talk about the biodiversity crisis. Biodiversity encompasses diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. And all of these levels of biodiversity are declining faster than at any time in our history. Around the world, there are about 1 million animal and plant species facing extinction, many of them within decades. Since 1950, no, I'm sorry, not 1950, since 1970, we've lost, actually, this number needs to be updated. We've lost about 3 billion birds in North America alone. And a major reason for this is a loss of an important food source for birds, which is insects. So the vast majority of birds at some point in their lifespan either ingest insects or feed them to their young. And around the world, about 41% of insect species are declining and are at risk. New research came out recently that since the year 2000 in the United States, we've lost 22% of our butterflies. So that's just one example. So this is the bad news. The good news is that we can take action on this. I also want to say that we have about 400 species of native bees in Massachusetts, and honeybees are not native. So I do have some resources explaining that. Ecological gardening is not designed to support honeybees. I mean, it will feed them, but they actually compete for resources with native bees. So if you want to learn more about that, I have a slide with information about that. So insects are supremely important for a variety of reasons. They really keep all ecosystems functioning. They pollinate many food crops, so much of the fresh produce that we eat is possible because insects have pollinated those plants, and which enables them to produce fruit and vegetables. Insects pollinate 90% of flowering plants, so those plants are depending on insects to pollinate them so that they can reproduce. As you can see in this picture, insects are food for many species, and then there are other species that eat the ones that eat insects. So they're really an essential part of the food hub and really across the world. And while there are a number of causes of the decline in insect populations, habitat loss is the major cause. This includes industrial agriculture, it includes urbanization, it includes deforestation, but it also includes the widespread use of non-native plants. Most of our conventional plant nurseries are full of non-native plants. Most of our gardens are full of non-native plants. And I want to explain that native plants are really important for supporting insects. They have been evolving together for 125 million years so that plants depend on insects to pollinate them in order to reproduce, and insects depend on native plants for food, both for adults and for what they feed to their offspring. So without native plants, our native insects really can't reproduce and survive. So over time, insects and native plants have evolved to have very specialized relationships. And the reason for this is plants produce chemicals to protect themselves from being devoured by insects, but they produce different plants produce different chemicals. And while insects have evolved to bypass the toxicity of the chemicals, they've only been able to do that for specific species of plants. So 90% of insects require specific plants for food for themselves or for their offspring and can't survive without those plants. And in return, most plants can only be pollinated by limited species of insects. So most plants that we import from other ecoregions and other continents And most plants that humans have hybridized, altered to select for certain traits, provide little to no benefit to insects. So I have another talk that really focuses more on that, and Heidi Dollard does too. They're both posted in the Conservation District website. So I'm not going to go into more detail about that, but you can find more information about it. So I'm just wanting to explain why it's so important that we use native plants in our gardens. And when we do that, we provide the basis for supporting a whole web of life. So I want to give examples of the networks of relationships you can support in your garden when you're using native plants. So there are relationships between insects and plants, as I started talking about. Insects will feed on nectar. They will collect pollen. Bees collect, and other insects collect pollen to feed to their young. In the process, they're pollinating plants, which enable plants to reproduce. They're butterfly and moth larvae, so the caterpillars of moths and butterflies eat leaves. So you can see in the upper right corner, that's a monarch caterpillar eating a milkweed leaf. And insects also nest with plant materials. So on the bottom right, that's a leaf cutter bee flying off with a little piece of leaf that it will line its nest with. So birds have relationships with plants as well, and one relationship is that plants help them create and find shelter. So there are birds that will nest in cavities in trees. You can see an owl on the left. You can see a woodpecker creating a hole, both by it's getting food, but it's also creating a hole to nest in. And birds also build nests out of many different kinds of material, which is one reason to not clean up your garden in the fall, because birds are going to use twigs, they can use the fluff from milkweed seeds, they use leaves, they use grass clippings, they use fiber from plant stems. I was just chopping back a little bit of some milkweed stalks in my garden this morning, and there are these long fibers in the stems, and I've seen birds carry that off for their nests. They can use moss. So leaving natural dried material in your garden is really helpful for birds. It's helpful for other reasons too, but that is one reason. And then birds also rely on plants for food. So you can see a hummingbird on the left getting nectar from a bee balm plant. In the middle, you can see cedar waxwing birds, which to me are just gorgeous, amazing birds, eating the berries of elderberry plants. And you can see a goldfinch getting seed from an echinacea plant on the right. So this is another reason to leave plant stems up. If you leave them up all winter, their seeds will be available for birds to use as food. And here's a network of relationships. Featuring bumblebees. So on the left, you can see a bumblebee gathering pollen to feed to its young. So what I didn't say earlier is that most native bees are solitary. They don't live in big hives like honeybees. So they dig holes in the ground, they nest in grasses, they nest in trees. So here's a bumblebee gathering pollen, which it will leave in its nest, either in soil or in grasses. And when the eggs hatch, they'll eat the pollen and grow up to be an adult bumblebee, which will be able to pollinate more plants. So these materials, having a little bare soil, leaving dry grasses on your property also is important for allowing bees to nest. So insects have relationships with trees too. So I mentioned that moths and butterflies lay their eggs on leaves. They can use small plants like milkweed plants as host, those are known as host plants. But trees and shrubs are really important host plants because of the vast quantity of foliage that they produce. So here's an example of a yellow birch tree. And you can see in the middle, the leaves are getting munched by a caterpillar. So this is a good reason not to worry when you see holes in leaves. It's actually good news. You can see the tree's perfectly healthy, and they're caterpillars that need to eat the leaves, and then they grow up. And this one is an example of an eastern yellow swallowtail butterfly, which becomes a butterfly and can pollinate plants. So trees are really important host plants for many, many species of insects. Here is a ground cover example of a host plant. This is pussy toes. On the left, you just see the foliage. In the middle, you can see it in bloom. There's a little bloodroot plant that popped up in the middle there. And the American lady butterfly relies on that plant as a host plant. So it lays its eggs on it. Again, the caterpillars munch on the leaves, and then you get an adult butterfly. Here's another relationship of a spice bush feeding birds with fruit. They produce berries. It's also a host plant for the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. So the butterfly will lay its eggs on the leaves and you'll get that very cute caterpillar, and then that can grow up to be a beautiful butterfly, which will go on to pollinate other plants. And here's a relationship between birds and insects as food. So there's research showing that one nest of chickadees requires 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed its young. And if there are not enough native trees and shrubs in the neighborhood, again, I mentioned that native trees and shrubs provide foliage that is eaten by caterpillars. So you need the native trees to provide enough foliage for the caterpillars to eat, for there to be enough caterpillars for the birds to feed to their nest of young. If the amount of native plant foliage, native woody plant foliage in a neighborhood drops below 70%, there's not enough caterpillars being produced for the nest of baby birds to survive. So another reason why it's really important to grow native plant trees and shrubs to be host plants for moths and butterflies, because that also will support bird populations. So here's several examples of birds using insects as food. That's a flicker, which is a bird which will forage on the ground looking for insects. You can see robins doing that too. Here's another network of relationships. I mentioned milkweed as a host plant for monarch butterflies. So on the far left, you can see a monarch butterfly egg on a milkweed plant. In the middle, you can see a monarch caterpillar on a milkweed leaf. And again, that's the only kind of leaf that caterpillar can eat. So this caterpillar will either become food for birds, as you can see in the upper right, or it will evolve into an adult butterfly. And actually, most caterpillars are eaten, but we want the butterflies and moths, but we also need to feed the birds. So both of those services are really important, and again, depend on having native host plants in your garden. So what's going to happen in a native garden when you're maintaining it is that there's going to be a lot of change, and I'll be talking about the different kinds of change. And as things change in your garden, what you need to think about is you're balancing what's pleasing and useful for you in your garden. You need to enjoy it if you're going to take care of it, and what will benefit the species in your ecosystem in the choices you're making in your garden. So these are two things that I'm always weighing out when I'm thinking about intervening in my garden one way or another, balancing what's aesthetically pleasing, what's convenient, and what's going to provide the most benefit to the other species that are sharing this little piece of land. So you have aesthetic choices in ecological gardening, ranging from you can make a pretty tidy, conventional looking garden using nothing but native plants. At the other end of the spectrum, you can let your garden go pretty wild and be a wild meadow. You can let trees come in. You can kind of let nature take over and just take out plants that don't belong there, mostly invasive non-native plants. And then there's something in between, this is all up to you, a kind of an English cottage style garden, which, can look kind of free and untidy. And you can do that with all native plants and using ecological landscape practices. So again, I'm not going to go into those practices in great detail, but I'm going to enumerate them all in the resource slide, so you can use that as a reference. And again, this is all up to you unless you live somewhere which is really limiting the choices you have. And in that case, you have a couple choices. You can try to get the rules changed, or you can just do what you're allowed to do, but using native plants. And there's some resources for helping people intervene with their homeowner association if they're restricting what you're doing to an unnecessary degree. So these are some of the ways that gardens will change. Volunteer plants will come in, which can either be native plants or invasive plants, or maybe non-native plants that aren't invasive, but they've popped in from your neighbor's garden. Uh, there will be changes in growth. So plants might get taller than you expect. They might spread faster than you thought they would. There could be changes in light. So trees will grow and you'll have more shade, or a tree might come down and you'll have more sun, or somebody might build something near you and it'll cast more shade. And then climate change, of course, is creating change that we're all having to deal with in terms of greater heat, inconsistent temperatures in the winter, drought, flooding. So these are all changes that we need to respond to in one way or another. So looking at volunteers, these are plants that are brought into your garden or moved into your garden by insects, by birds, by wind, by mammals. I have a lot of little oak trees that get planted in my garden by squirrels. Often when a plant shows up in your garden, it's picked a better spot than you might for it. So that's something to consider if it's going to do well there. So anyway, when a plant pops up that unexpectedly you didn't choose to put it there are a number of questions you can ask. Is it a native plant? Do you like it? Is it going to be healthy in that spot? And will it fit the space? So you always want to have the right plant for the spot, meaning in ecological terms, that the site conditions suit what the plant needs, that it's getting the right amount of light and moisture for the needs of the plant. But also, is it going to suit your use of the garden? So those are all things to be thinking about when you're considering what's growing in your garden and whether you want it in that spot or not. So here's an example of a volunteer. So again, thinking about, do you want a volunteer or not? This is one that I always want. This is bloodroot plant. It's beautiful plant that comes up in the spring. It's ephemeral, meaning that it dies back at some point during the summer, but I think they're gorgeous and kind of magical looking. I love the leaves even after the flower is gone. So I'm looking at the left-hand side now. So one thing that's really interesting about bloodroot is their seeds have a little fatty substance on them that ants love. So ants will take the seed, bring it to their nest, eat that fatty substance, and then throw the seed away in their trash pile. And so bloodroot is planted by ants. So if you look at this middle picture, I planted some bloodroot kind of on the left-hand side above that little flagstone. And it's popping up in other places where I didn't put it, so I know that ants planted it there. So you can see some in the middle of the grasses in the middle. There's also, you can see ferns up in the top. In this right-hand picture, you can see the bloodroot coming up under the ferns. So to me, bloodroot is a magical plant and I love it and I leave it wherever it pops up. But it might be kind of ruining a design that you want. You can always dig it up and move it somewhere else if you want to. So then there's the question of, if native plants are popping up, do you want to weed them or not? So this, you can see a hint of a little flagstone path in this garden, and I don't use it for very much except to drag a hose through the garden most of the time. And so I often let weeds pop up in there. I get violets, I get seedlings from all kinds of plants, and I mostly leave it alone unless I'm going to be on a garden tour and I really want to tidy up the garden. And then I decide if I'm going to weed things out and give them away or move them. So again, you have a choice. How do you want your garden to look? They're all beneficial plants that are coming up. So you could just leave them, but you might have another purpose for that spot. And then invasive plants will come in and they are always unwelcome. So it's important to identify them. And there's certain apps you can use for ID and booklets you can use. I'm actually making myself a note to make sure these are in the resource slides. And you want to remove them. Some are easier to take out than others. If you have a big infestation, that can be really difficult. Heidi Dollard has a whole recorded talk on dealing with invasive plants, so that could be really helpful. So you want to take them out and replant that area with native plants that will be fast spreading because they'll help compete with the invasive plants, which will always try to return. And then you have to keep an eye on the spot and just keep, taking them out as soon as you see them. The more frequently you remove them, the more successful you're going to be, because if you leave them for long periods of time, they're photosynthesizing and the roots are growing, and then you have more plant to remove. So that's a problem that we need to stay on top of. So it would also help if we could get some statewide and municipal help with removing invasive plants, because they are taking over territory from the native plants that we need, and it's a really big problem. So more help beyond what we can do individually in our own properties would be great. So that's something we can work towards. So another way of managing change in the garden is growth patterns. And one kind of growth is height. And sometimes plants get taller than we expect. If a really tall plant is next to a seating area or next to a path, it can just feel like you're getting crowded, or it feels a little overpowering. Again, this is not an ecological choice. This has to do with a human comfort choice. Um, really tall plants might tower over other plants and look out of proportion. They might be too tall for the width of the bed. Sometimes if they don't have other plants around them supporting them, they'll flop over. So those can be problems with tall plants. And here's some of the solutions. You can move them to the back of a bed, put it against a fence or a wall. You can grow other plants around it to help hold it up. Sometimes these plants evolved in prairies where plants are growing together really densely and they help each other stand. You could stake it. And then another intervention you can make if it's in the right spot and you like it, but it's still too tall. If it's a plant that blooms late summer or fall, you can cut it in half in late June or early July, and it will branch out, it will bloom a little bit later, and it'll grow about 1/3 shorter. So that's an option to try out. So height can also not necessarily have to do with being hugely tall. It might just be the site where you have it. So this is a pathway where there used to be not super tall plants, but just tall enough that they would flop into the path. It would be hard to walk through it. It was impossible to run a compost bin through there. So this is a path next to my house. I moved the taller plants to another area and replaced them with shorter ones. And now I really enjoy how that path looks. And it's also just much more convenient to use it. This is just a picture of that path at a really nice blooming moment. So that was a nice thing to share, kind of late spring, native flowers blooming together. So another issue with height can be on a crowded path, but this was a different solution. So this is a tall plant, black cohosh, next to a narrow path. Um, it tends to get floppy. The leaves kind of stay in place, but the plant stalks get really tall, and by late summer, they kind of start leaning over. It can't be shortened with the Chelsea chop because the flowers are growing on a separate stalk. But bumblebees love this plant. It gets covered with bees that just literally roll around in the pollen and you can just hear them buzzing. So my solution in this spot is to stake it, leave it where it is. It's a little inconvenient, but it's very enjoyable. And for me, it's worth the inconvenience because I just love having those plants there. So again, you have a, you're constantly have a range of choices and you decide what works best for you. So another issue with height can be the space next to the tall plants. So on the right-hand side, all these plants are tall, but they're next to a really wide lawn. So the height is not a problem. On the left-hand side, they're next to a narrower path, and the really tall plants start leaning in. It starts feeling uncomfortable. So you can see in the front there's some black-eyed Susan. That's pretty much a good height to have next to a narrow path. So I would move that tall ironweed back to another space where it won't lean into the path. So you've seen this picture before, but this is another illustration of what can be a problem here. I was talking about weeding the flagstones before. Now I'm looking at the height. So the Joe Pye weed that you can see, the tall pink plant, gets much taller than that by late summer. It's pretty tall for the spot. It tends to flop over and overwhelm the other plants. I've tried staking it and tying it to the fence. And I think this year I'm going to try the Chelsea chop and just see if I cut it down, over the next few weeks by late June, and just see if keeping it a little shorter will work. And if it doesn't, the next solution is to move it or give it away. So here's another growth pattern issue, and that can be fast spreading plants. So, whenever we're planting a new garden, we usually have an image in our mind of how we want it to be, and then it changes. So the first question is, this isn't what I wanted, but is is it okay the way it's changing? Is this going to work? So that's one thing. Can you just accept it? If for some reason it's not working, can you divide the plant and move parts of it away? If it's running over other plants, maybe you need to move it to a place where it's not going to be a constant problem where you're constantly having to pull it back from other plants. It could grow in a meadow. It could grow in an open space where you want to fill it quickly. You can put it where you're replacing invasive plants. And again, you could give it away. So here's something to think about if you're considering giving plants away. Jumping worms, some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not. There's an article about it in the resource slide, so you can read up on it if you want. But if you're sure you have no jumping worms, so again, I'd educate yourself so that you can figure out if you have them or not. If you don't have them, it's fine to give your plants away. If your plants are seedlings that are in fresh, clean soil, it's fine to give those away. If you have jumping worms, I wouldn't give them away unless the gardener who's accepting them already has worms, or unless you've really thoroughly washed the roots on your own property. Make sure there's no eggs left in the roots, and just make sure the person you're giving the plants to understands what they're getting, because there's a little risk that you're spreading them. I just want to put that warning in there. So again, dealing with fast spreading plants, here are some ways to use them. They can be temporary fillers in a new spot. Maybe you want to put in a really big new native plant bed, but you don't want to fill it immediately. You can put filler plants in some part of it. Some of them are really easy to uproot, so you can just take them out where they pop up. So I'm going to give you some examples here. The common milkweed on the left spreads pretty fast. It's easy to pull out, so that's something that can be shared or composted or moved. Hay-scented fern is a little harder to stay on top of. It just has rhizomes that are fine, and even if you pull it out, it's likely to pop up again. So that's something you want to put in a place where you can kind of let it take over. On the upper right is mountain mint. Some of them grow really fast, some of them are a little slower growing. If you have a fast growing spreading one, that one is great to have in a wild meadow setting. Or if you have a big enough garden and you don't mind, kind of controlling the edges of where it spreads, that's fine too. And then jewelweed is on the lower right-hand corner. That's an annual that reseeds every year. Very beneficial plant, beloved by many insects and hummingbirds. But again, it can completely fill an area, but it's really easy to root out. So I don't mind letting that pop up, and then when it's still young, I pull the young plants out where I know I'm not going to want a 4-foot plant later in the summer. So these are all ways to manage fast spreading plants, and again, you have the option of giving things away. Here's some other examples. Wild strawberry grows pretty fast. It's a very beneficial plant. I find that if I mix it with this variety of carex, they grow well together. It's a nice very beneficial ground cover. But when it starts moving in with my chrysogonum, that yellow flowered plant, it tends to crowd that out. So I'm kind of struggling with where to, it's a lot of work to weed that out. It sends out little shoots, so it kind of jumps from place to place. So I do want it in parts of my garden, not other parts. So again, this is one where you need to make decisions. Is it worth it to keep where it's going to encroach in places where you don't want it? So gardener's decision. And I want to use goldenrod as another example. There are some that spread like mad. They will take over a whole field. I want to say here they do not cause hay fever or allergies, so you don't have to be worried about that. Goldenrod is a super beneficial plant in the fall. It supports many, many species of insects at a really important time for them to be storing food. And there are goldenrods that don't spread. So if you have a small garden or a place where you just don't want it spreading, there are clumping varieties that will stay put. There's also goldenrod for sun, for shade, for dry soil, for wet soil, different heights. So there's like 2 dozen native varieties in Massachusetts, and you really can find something that will suit any condition that you have. But again, this is another way of making a choice about having a spreading variety or something that will clump and stay put and might suit what you want in your garden better. This is another fast spreader. This is Canadian anemone. You can see how pretty it is, but it can spread and just really take over. So I'm actually tired of staying on top of it. I have a friend with a backyard that tends to fill up with invasive plants and no one really uses it. So this is one of the plants I'm going to move there because that's a nice aggressive plant that will help keep the invasives out. But you might have a spot where you'll enjoy it and it won't, become a problem. So another way that gardens can change is changes in light. So if you look on the left, you can see a tree stump where I took out a non-native invasive pear tree and I put in a little gray birch. And because there used to be a tree there, those shade plants, you can see the trunk of the pear tree in the picture on the right. So that tree's no longer there. And I'm going to have to watch and see when the summer gets hot and the sun is beating down how much light these shade plants are going to get and if they're going to be okay there because it's going to be a while before that birch fills in. So I'll need to see, do I have the right plants for the current growing conditions? And then there are places where you can get increased shade. This is an elm tree that grew really rapidly. It's this gorgeous, again, very beneficial native tree, a canopy tree. And the plants that are under it are getting less light, they're getting taller, they're getting skinnier, they're getting floppier. So again, here's that corner with the Joe Pye weed. The shade is also impacting what's happening to those plants. So again, I'm eventually going to have a decision to make. Can they really flourish in that spot, or do they need to be moved to where they can get more sun? And then climate change is another change that we're all dealing with. So I had shown a picture of the front yard, which is near a really hot street, and this native ginger plant was doing well there for years, and then the heat every summer increased and we had drought, and even though I watered, by the middle of the summer, the leaves looked unhappy and brown the way they do on the left. And I gave it time. I waited a few years to see, is this consistent or are they going to recover and be okay? Every spring they'd look fine. Every summer they looked miserable. So I realized this is not a good spot for this plant anymore. So I moved it to the backyard, which is cooler. And you can see on the right, that's how it looks in the back. Here's a picture. They're fine there. It's not that far from the street, but it's just enough cooler that they can thrive in that spot. So those are questions to ask yourself. When something is no longer thriving, do you have another place you can put it where it has better growing conditions for what that plant requires? And this is the front yard where I took out the ginger, and this is right after I replaced it. So what I did was I did research to find drought-resistant plants. It's also a shady spot, and I did. And this was several years ago. The plants are actually have completely filled in and they're thriving. So there really are native plants for every growing condition. And I'll show you resources for where you can find the plants for the site conditions that you have. So here's a little more information about climate change. Our hardiness zones have changed. This map shows the average low winter temperatures over 30 years. In 2012, most of the hill towns were in zone 5B, so the average low winter temperature was -15 to -10. Now it's mostly 6A, so the average low is -10 to -5. And along with that, our summers have really gotten hotter, which I'm sure everyone has noticed. So the American Horticultural Society now produces a heat zone map, and I zoomed in on Massachusetts, which is kind of fuzzy looking. But it looks like in the hill towns in the western part of the state, the zones are now 4, 3, and 2, depending on your elevation. So the average number of days per year that are above 86 degrees has changed over time. And I never used to really look at hardiness zones that much. I kind of thought, if the plant's being sold around here, it can handle the winter. Now I'm thinking, can it handle the summer? So I realized that when I planted that little gray birch, I hadn't thought about that. And I will show you that this might turn out to be a problem. Now, if I'm not worrying about it with herbaceous perennials, but with any woody plant, I really want to think about our temperatures are going to keep increasing, and is the plant that lives decades or hundreds of years going to be able to handle the change? So now I'm looking at the hardiness zone for how much heat the plant can handle, and I'm planning to choose plants from the center of my hardiness zone or with a higher number. I'll show you a chart to make this a little clearer. So for using the birch tree as an example, also, this is a very small sample of spreadsheets that are in the resource slides that you'll have access to. So this is just looking at birch trees that are native in Massachusetts. The one at the bottom is the one I planted. So it's hardy from zone 2 to 6. So 2 is the coldness number, and it'll be fine here. And 6 is the heat number. So we are zone 6 already. And in 20 years, it might have increased. So I don't know if this tree is going to be happy for decades. So I thought, should I have planted something else? I'm looking at river birch. It goes to zone 9. All the birch trees that can take hotter summers than the gray birch also need moist soil. And the place where I've planted it does not have moist soil. It needs dry soil. So it may be that birch trees aren't going to do so well in cities in eastern Massachusetts for very long. We're just going to have to see how they do. So it's just one other variable to keep in mind when especially when you're choosing woody plants. But it's not the only variable to think about, because we not only want to choose plants that will tolerate the heat, but we want to continue to choose plants that will support other species. So oak trees are native to the US. There are many species. It's the most beneficial plant you can put in the ground for providing support to, many insect, but also other species. It's hardy to zone 3 to 9. So oak trees in our area will support over 500 insect species. Ginkgo trees are widely planted. They're from China. They're also hardy in zones 3 to 9. They support one species of insect, and they've been here over 240 years, and so that has not improved over time. So again, if you can choose a plant that will suit your hardiness zone, that will support many species over one that will support 0 to very few, then choose the one that will support the most. And I just want to talk about genetic diversity here, because if you're getting plants that are grown from seed, they'll have a lot more resilience to climate change and other adverse events that can happen. So seed-grown plants means insects have carried pollen from, or wind has carried pollen from one plant to another. And so there's genetic diversity. The genes have been mixed, just like humans vary from person to person because of genetic diversity. And it means that there may be plants that can handle an adverse condition. Out of a large population, maybe some of them can. And here's an example of this. We've been losing ash trees to the emerald ash borer. Scientists have found that 10% of trees have genetic resistance to the emerald ash borer. So if all the trees were cloned, which is often what you'll find in a nursery, the trees are all genetically exactly the same. It could be that all the ash trees would be wiped out. But if you get seed-grown plants, you're getting plants with, genetic variation, and some of them may be able to handle a heat wave or a drought or a flood or an insect infestation. So getting seed-grown plants is another way of protecting the genetic diversity in our ecoregion. And here's another quirky aspect of seed-grown plants. They have other kinds of genetic diversity, so they may have variable height. So when you look at the spreadsheet of plants, it tells you how tall they get, how wide they get, and it might say something like height, 3 to 5 feet. So you think, oh, that's really different from getting a plant in a nursery that's a clone and they tell you exactly how tall it's going to get. You think, well, do I plant it in the middle of the bed or the back of the bed? What am I going to do with this plant? So you make a guess, you put it in. I mean, I really enjoy it. You can mix plants. You can see this echinacea and liatris plants. All are varied, and it's kind of fun looking at them all together. So you can mix them. Or if a plant pops up and it's really in the wrong spot, you can move it somewhere else. So it's a kind of fun, slightly unpredictable aspect of growing native plants from seed, but it's something you can enjoy and make use of. So just to kind of summarize what this is about, you're really in a native plant garden is something that you have a relationship with because it's going to change. It's not static. It's not like hanging a picture on the wall. So you're continually thinking about what do you want this garden to be so that it makes you happy and so you can use it? And how do you want it to support wildlife? So it requires getting to know your plants, getting to understand what's best for them, knowing where they're going to be in a place where they can thrive. I find over time, I have fallen in love with my plants. I have gotten fallen in love with all the wildlife that they attract, and I've started learning about birds and insects that I didn't know about. I just think it's a very exciting way to garden and very fulfilling. And so if you're thinking about this, you put the plants where they're going to be happy and where you'll be happy with them. You're part of the ecosystem too. And we can all, create thriving ecological gardens where we're happy and we're supporting other species. So I just want to encourage that and celebrate that. And I have this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. In the Western tradition, there's a recognized hierarchy of beings with the human being on top and the plants at the bottom. But in native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the way that they live. They teach us by example. They've been on the earth far longer than we have been and have had time to figure things out. So, just a reminder to have humility and see ourselves as a part of nature and that we don't have all the answers and that we have a lot to learn and that that's very rewarding and enjoyable. I also want to just advocate for listening to the talks and reading the books of Robin Wall Kimmerer because she's a very inspiring woman from an indigenous tradition who's also a trained scientist. So she brings those two worlds of knowledge together. So now I'm going to quickly go through the resource slides and show you what you'll have access to in a PDF. So these first two pages are just summaries of garden practices that support biodiversity. So I'm not going to go into this in any detail. This is something you can read as a reference. Here's the map about the changes in hardiness zones, the heat zones. These are native plant spreadsheets. So this first one is very comprehensive. There's hundreds of plants on it. These are plants that are good for gardens, but also for meadows and habitat restoration. There are tabs at the bottom for different types of plants. And there's also links for each plant so that you can get more information and see pictures. The next spreadsheet is really aimed at gardeners, so it's a shorter list. There's also starter kits included in it. So if you're kind of starting out with native plants, you don't have to restrict yourself to that, but it might be an easy way to get groupings of native plants that are easy to grow and will bloom from spring through fall, all different heights. So again, that's something to explore. Native plants for containers, a spreadsheet of the plants that support endangered insects in Massachusetts. This is just a sample of the spreadsheet so you can see the information you'll get into it. I don't want to spend time on this because you'll have time to explore it. These are lists of plants. The keystone plants of New England are plants that support by far the most species. And then pollinator plants by season of bloom, plants you can put in the ground after you've removed invasive plants. So again, just more places to get information. These are things to think about when you're shopping for plants so that you're getting the plants that are most ecologically beneficial, so that you're getting the straight species, not hybrids, plants grown without pesticides, plants grown from seed. And again, unless you're at a native plant nursery, communicate with people, communicate with landscapers, with nursery owners if it's a conventional nursery, and tell them what you want, because the more they know this is what we're looking for, the more they're actually providing it. And then this is a spreadsheet of nurseries where you can shop for native plants in Massachusetts or by mail order. These are information about problems you might run into, invasive plants, rabbits, and jumping worms. This is the information I said I would share about the impact of honeybees on our ecosystem. This is more information about creating healthy habitat. This is where I do native plant research, and it's a great place to get more information about plants. Native Plant Trust Plant Finder, Prairie Moon Nursery, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center all have very informative websites if you want more information. Oh, so I'm going to fix this sheet because it should have the Hampden County Conservation District link on it. I'll make sure that's in there because that's a great place to get information. These are all local organizations where you can visit websites. I want to say with the Mass Pollinator Network, since this is not a live meeting that we're having, if you have questions, you can go to this website and we provide a Google group where you can ask questions online. We also have a monthly Zoom meeting where you can just show up and everyone's welcome if you have questions about native plant gardening. So those are places you can get more information. You can also, my email address is on the front slide, so you can send questions directly to me too, since if you're watching this, I'm not present anymore and you may have questions and I'd like you to be able to get answers. So these are all wonderful local organizations where you can get lots of information. These are national ones, very informative. These are newsletters I really enjoy. And these are my favorite native plant and ecological habitat books. So I just want to end with, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I really hope you enjoy welcoming wildlife to your garden and all the pleasure that that can bring.
So thank you so much, Amy. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to continuing to learn from you going forward.
Thanks, Megan, for running this series. It's been great. Thanks, everybody.